Hello and welcome to the 81 All Out podcast. Like many of you listening, I'm deeply saddened by the tragic events that are unfolding in India. Some of my closest friends have been directly affected by the coronavirus, either because they have tested positive and they are recovering, or because they are grieving after the loss of their loved ones. We at 81 All Out have been discussing how we can show our solidarity for what is happening and how we can contribute. So we have decided that all the funds that we receive for the support of our show, we have decided that over the months of May and June, it will be donated to UNICEF, which is currently raising funds for the fight against COVID in India. They are delivering vital supplies and they are providing valuable support on the ground. For our part, we have decided to match your contributions for up to $800 US, and we hope that will be a small contribution in this big fight against this virus. So please follow the link in the show notes as you usually do. We understand that you can donate to any organizations that you wish in your own capacity, but in this case, we too will be matching that amount till a certain cap. And for whatever you donate in May and June, will go towards that, and we will also be contributing.
In the air, Srijan takes it! India win! He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is Siddhartha Vaidyanathan, and I'm joined by my co-host Mahesh. Hi, Mahesh. Hope all
Hey,
well.
Sarvi.
Yep, and we're thrilled today to be recording the 100th episode of the 81 All Out podcast, which is probably 80 more episodes or 85 more episodes than what we had foreseen when we started. But it's been a great ride, and thank you to all our listeners and generous supporters. So hopefully we'll continue podding. Anyway, so to celebrate this milestone, this is a podcast, so we can't really raise anything. But what we have done is we've got a special guest along, Gideon Haigh, an author and writer who we deeply admire. And on his website, Gideon refers to himself as an independent cricket journalist, which is probably like the biggest understatement anyone has ever made about anything. But, well, it is probably a fact that he is an independent cricket journalist. And I like this one part of his website where he has this page called Things I Like. And among other things, he lists Michelangelo's David, Middlemarch, and Peppa Pig, as well as Chris Tavrade's forward defensive stroke. So that sort of gives you an idea of Gideon's encyclopedic range and knowledge and everything. And so welcome to the show, Gideon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's nice to be here. And what a privilege to be part of your 100th show.
It's a great privilege for us, Gideon. And you were telling us that you're becoming some kind of a podcasting veteran these days.
Podcasting whore. It seems like I'm selling my favours pretty cheaply, in fact. It's almost as though I do more podcasting now than I do writing. It's ridiculous. It's the new blogging, isn't it? It's the new blogging. Pretty soon we'll be pogging or vodding or something like that. But yeah, I seem to spend a lot of time talking about cricket and less time than I'd like writing about it. But there you go. You've got to go with the market, don't you?
Well, yeah, that's the sign of the times. As I was telling you, maybe, a book as a podcast, maybe your next book as a complete podcast, 5 hours, maybe.
I did actually once do an audio book of The Vincibles, my book on my club season. And it took ages to do. I thought it was quite a short book. It seemed to take bloody hours. It seemed to be longer than the season to read it out.
Try and do it on your office book. I think you'll stop entertaining the idea.
Anyway, so we're here today to talk to Gideon about his book On Warne that he published in 2012, which is a remarkable book for various reasons. And I've actually never spoken to Gideon about it, though I've read it multiple times. And it's a fascinating book because it takes this great cricketer and sort of captures almost so much about him in that little volume. And the structure and the writing and everything is great. I mean, I'm sure somebody who picks up the book 50 years later, hopefully it's still around, will completely understand what it meant to be living in the age of Shane Warne and also watching cricket in the 90s and 2000s. So Gideon, the first book I read of yours was actually Mystery Spinner by about Jack Iverson. And it seems like such a contrast to me that here you have this obscure cricketer who you decided to unearth. And then here you're writing about the most famous cricketer perhaps the most famous cricketer Australia has produced after Bradman.
Well, one was my idea and one wasn't. Mystery Spinner was my idea because I went to the same school as Jack Iverson, and I was fascinated by the fact when I was growing up that while we memorialised the other Test cricketers who'd come from Geelong College, Lindsay Hassett and Paul Sheehan and Ian Redpath, there was no trace of Jack Iverson. But I knew he'd been to the school. I just couldn't find any sort of evidence that we'd played a part in his cricket creation. And that sort of made me think, I'd like to find out more about this player. It was very difficult to do so because his career had been vanishingly brief and he disappeared into obscurity. Virtually the only thing that I knew about him after his career was that he'd taken his own life. So with clutching those few facts, I went off in search of him. And the book is partly about the search for the biographical material as well as the biography itself. Of course, with Warne, yes, you're quite right. It's the opposite. The question here was sort of squeezing him down to human proportions because he seemed to be everywhere. He seemed to be in the atmosphere, in the gyprock of the walls. Once he'd grown up in the 90s and 2000s in Australia, he was kind of inescapable and all-consuming. But it wasn't my idea. In some ways, perhaps it was too obvious an idea for me to come up with. My publisher, Ben Ball, said to me one day, well, why don't you do a book about Warne? And I thought, that's an interesting idea to sort of bring him down to a scale where he could be treated between covers. But I'd have to find a way to do it that didn't simply do Warne from A to Z. I could do Warne D, L, Q, and W. But Warne in that sense is a gift because his story is so well known that you don't actually need to recapitulate it at length. You can actually just pick the eyes out of it. You can concentrate on those things that are closest to elucidating the legend. I chose my time advisedly. 2012 was a few years after he'd stopped playing even T20 cricket, so it was possible to remember him at his very peak and to cherish those particular memories. And he hadn't quite. He was in the process, perhaps, of phasing into being a sort of a 24/7 social media self-parody, but I wanted to get him before that stage. So it was good advice from Ben and a great opportunity which I seized with both hands.
Is it true that you wrote this book in 1 month?
Yeah. It was a 31-day month though. So as I sometimes put out, it was March. March 2012.
Yeah, but it's amazing to me because for a book that's been written in such a speed, it still comes across as reading it. I mean, I had no idea about this 1 month period until Mahesh told me recently. But what I can see in this book is like a lifetime worth of observing and experience that has actually gone into it. It's so much more than, it's amazing when people say he wrote a book in X number of days, but the lead up to the X number of days is what eventually counts. Yeah.
Sure. They've done a lot of reading and a lot of thinking and a lot of writing and a lot of watching of Warne before I got to that point. Simple fact is that 2011-12, I'd been busy covering a tour. I'd been busy covering, I think, the Indian tour of Australia. Just hadn't had time to get around to doing it. So, I sat down at the end of that season and thought, right, okay, well, how will I do this? And in some ways, it benefited from being done quickly because you just took the phone off the hook and you slammed the door behind you and you started writing. And I also decided that it was important to enjoy it, because what was Warne about if not enjoyment? There was sort of no particular pain or angst to access in the Warne story. It was just a hayride, and if you couldn't enjoy running about Warne, then you really had to reconsider your vocation.
Absolutely. You didn't think of the structure is interesting for me because you've gone with thematic rather than chronological. You've gone with the art of Warne, the making of Warne, the art of Warne, the men of Warne, the trials of Warne, and the sport of Warne.
Yeah.
Which is, again, structurally quite different, I would think, compared to the Iverson or any of even The Big Ship.
Yeah.
The Big Ship, the fantastic biography of Warwick Armstrong. So again, what were the thoughts on that? Was that your way to sort of condense the whole thing rather than going more, say, encyclopedic?
Well, Sid, you're crediting me with more artist craft than I actually have. I think I just started writing, and at various points I seem to have written enough. And then I thought, I'll come in from this angle and this angle. I don't do a lot of planning. I really don't. I just sort of, you plan as you write. In fact, the plan that kind of governs your writing is the enemy of good writing, because you should be enjoying it. You shouldn't be executing. You shouldn't be writing up like you're writing an academic report. You should actually be just allowing the story and your thoughts to shape themselves on the run. And I guess I've written a lot of books now, so I know that this kind of approach works. That I don't actually need to do a lot of premeditation. I can just do it. I can shape it on the wheel, if you like, rather than having to work from a blueprint. I think I'd had various little half-formed thoughts about Warne in his career, which I'd never had the opportunity to kind of fulfill or complete. So in that sense, it was fun to execute that, or to see some of those thoughts through to fruition. And at a certain point, I just stopped. It seemed like, I'd run out of time. I couldn't write anymore. So, but at a certain point, it just seemed like, that's the point at which to stop. I could have written another 5 chapters in the same vein, but it kind of had a sort of it was a fiver, if you like, the 5 chapters. I don't necessarily believe in numerology, but they did seem to capture Warne satisfactorily.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you that obviously the writing comes first, and then everything else comes afterwards. But there must have been some point of time when you decided that these were the directions in which the book would take, rather than that, or did that happen right at the end?
Sid, I hate to disappoint you, but I got to the end of it. Yep, job done.
Well, okay, that's one way to do it.
But that's as misleading as the 1 month timeline, right? I mean, you didn't write it in 1 month. I mean, the kind of observations that you make, even about him basically rubbing the ground and how he attains that earthen quality, it comes from over years of watching and over years of forming these pieces in your mind. So 1 month is just putting the puzzles together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It was a lifetime in the preparation, but a month in the writing. But I reached the end of it thinking that I'd enjoyed it, and that I might have more things to say, but I might end up just repeating myself. And also, look, Warne's a cricketer. There's no point in writing sort of 500, 1,000 word books about him. He's a great cricketer. He's an incredibly enjoyable cricketer to watch, but it shouldn't become a chore or a labour to have to go over his career. It should be zesty. It should be impressionistic. It should be vivid, and it should be brief, because Warne was there for a good time, not a long time.
Did it also help, Gideon, that you too are from Melbourne and grew up in Melbourne, and also pretty much would have seen the Melbourne that Warne saw when he was growing up? In fact, there is some lovely passages in the book talking about the media ecosystem and also the general state of the relationship between the famous and the public when in the 70s.
Yeah. And also helped being roughly the same age as Warne. He's 4 years younger than I am. He's the same age as my younger brother. In some respects, he's a kind of a kid brother figure. He's the guy who plays up, who takes liberties, who enjoys himself, and is occasionally a source of embarrassment, but ultimately has a good heart. That's the way in which we often look upon our kid brothers. And the other thing, of course, is that I had the opportunity to interview him during his career. I think I'd done half a dozen quite long interviews with him. I'd always found him a very agreeable and accessible interview subject, with certain apprehensions. Certainly early on in his career, he treated the media with a mixture of sort of an alternation between sort of naivety and circumspection before he became that kind of master of manipulating the media. In some respects, Warne was as adept at manoeuvring the media as he was at sort of moving the batsman round the crease. And because I had the opportunity to intersect with him at various times in his career, I did have a feeling for that process of maturation.
Fantastic. There was one point that really struck out for me where you're talking about that famous test in Sri Lanka in 1992, the SSC Test, where Warne basically bowls Australia to victory by getting those 3 wickets right at the end. And the point that you make there was by the time that you were trying to find out about, Border's instinct for using Warne at that point, and also what the Warne situation at that point where he had taken, I think, 1 for 346.
Yeah.
Is that, everything else seemed preordained. It's almost like, it was almost like it was impossible for you to go back into that state where Warne was still largely a nobody.
Yes, it was. It was the legend had become so encrusted that everything looked foreordained. I think the one thing that I was able to conclude from that moment, though, assessing it on its merits, was that Warne, the presence of Warne, or the aura of Warne, encouraged Alan Border, who was kind of like the ultimate sort of roundhead captain, to be more of a cavalier, to throw the dice, to take a chance. And that was something that succeeding Australian captains were going to enjoy, that opportunity. He made them look a better captain because they were able to throw him the ball and unleash this attacking weapon. Leg spin up until that moment, I think, in Australian or recent Australian history, had been looked upon as a rather expensive luxury, not the kind of thing that necessarily had a place in the increasingly rational and scientific approach to cricket that had become part and parcel of the game in the 80s.
So now I just had, for a brief moment, I had a revisionist history of everything I had known and thought about Mark Taylor as a captain. Like, if he gave that sort of liberty for Border, and then Mark Taylor came into the test team after Warne was fully formed.
Yes.
He could have been a very different captain without Warne being in the team.
I've always thought that the mythology of captaincy is hugely overestimated. It is all about the players that you've got and the faculties that they have and the strength of the opposition. And we do imbue captains with a strange sort of magic. In fact, they really, I think, only affect the game to a degree of about 5%. But we're very heavily invested in that idea, aren't we?
Especially, I would think, with the really strong teams, I would think the effective captaincy goes down that much more, rather than, say, captaining a weak team that's just about on the cusp of becoming good. Maybe captaincy may make slightly. But I feel like the Clive Lloyds and the Mark Taylors get a bit too much, and the Steve Waughs get a bit too much credit for what their players essentially were doing, which was excellence.
Yeah. The best captains, I think, are those who, a player leaves the dressing room and feels as though they played to the full extent of their capabilities, and perhaps even slightly beyond them. I think Ian Chappell, actually, in the mid 1970s. I think, particularly if you look at that team that he took to England in 1972, it's not a particularly strong team. And England are about as strong as they got in that period. But he matched England game for game. And 2-2 is a fair reflection of the strides that Ian made. If you look at the players who are in that side, your Rod Marshes and your Dennis Lillies, they become great players later on, but they're not great players at that point. They're in the process of being made.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about Ian Chappell, though, the very first time I met Warne, which was part of a press, which was at those, what do you call those? Press events that you have before the series, where the press gathers around one player, like we're like a pack of animals trying to get the most of them.
I've never been to one. I can't be asked.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But anyway, so I thought I was doing this. I thought I was being this really clever guy, and I asked Shane Warne about whether he thinks he would have been the perfect cricketer in the 70s. And then what followed was about a 5-minute talk about Shane Warne looking back at the 70s when he wasn't even a player, but he was so nostalgic about the time that he didn't even know too much about. Yes. And all these other journalists are like, why are you wasting our time by asking him this question? But I thought I'd done a great job. But your book makes a really good point about how, who knows if Shane Warne would have even made it had he been playing in the 70s.
No. He arrived at the perfect time when the academy had been created, but there was still a kind of license and discretion to be an individual. It had become sufficiently professional a game to support Warne, but not sufficiently rigid and bureaucratized to discourage Warne. I think Warne would have, even 5 years later, Warne might have fallen at the first hurdle and vanished into obscurity. And the 1970s, he would never have been able to balance a semi-professional cricket career with the need to earn a livelihood outside the game. He just didn't have that in him. So he's a cricketer perfectly of his time. He might identify with those 1970s cricketers, but I think he's got a very superficial understanding of what their ecosystem was really like.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you name, I think, about 5 or 6 spinners who just disappeared into oblivion, and he could have easily been one of them as well, right? Yes. Yeah. But though, having said that, there seems to be something natural about Ian Chappell's love for Warne, though. It's almost like he wished he had a cricketer like Warne in the team that he captained.
That's a good point, actually. That's a good point. They certainly got on very well. I think that's partly because of the natural deference that a cricketer has to the cricketer that they watched growing up. I think, part of Warne still can't quite believe that he's sort of talking to Ian Chappell, having imitated Ian Chappell in the backyard at home. There is that sort of natural kinship that he feels for a player who had the reputation that Ian Chappell had as a bit of a rebel, a guy who talked back to authority. Other parts of Warne do not marry up quite so well with Ian Chappell, in the sense that Warne was a prodigal individual who didn't necessarily always look after himself and was pretty focused on his own performance. I think it would have been interesting to see Ian Chappell captain Warne. I think he would have been very effective. He's very effective in captaining absolutely everyone, but it wouldn't have been an instantly natural marriage.
Absolutely. And the other thing, of course, about Warne and the era in which he played was that he was on TV. And, that was such a huge difference for everyone who saw him. And you, as you so evocatively write about his leg spin in The Art of Warne, I mean, it's almost, I'm sure you didn't do this, Gideon, but it's almost like you're watching a video clip of him at, say, 0.25x, and you're writing it. Obviously, you didn't do it, but it's
I don't know how to do
that. Exactly. You've done it out of sheer observation. But I'm saying that if anyone wants to go back to write in detail about Warne, they have all these resources that they can use. Unlike, say, the book, that lovely book you've written on Victor Trumper, and that photograph, where you have that photograph. That's it.
Yes,
yeah.
we do. But in some ways, Trumper is the first cricketer of the visual period. I think he's the first cricketer who was interpreted chiefly by visual means and can be apprehended now by those means. It just so happens to be one photograph, of which we have made a lot because there is otherwise a great scarcity of images about him. Where Warne's concerned, you're right, we have a superabundance of material to work with. And, it is true to say that I did look at that YouTube video of the ball of the century a lot. You just can't help it. And I wasn't doing it simply for critical analysis. It was pure recreation. It's a wonderful thing to watch. No matter how many times you watch it, it is amazing. And in some ways, you notice something slightly different each time. It really does repay inspection.
So a little bit of a digression here. Do you think it was the ball of the century?
As far as a moment in time is concerned, for it being his first ball in the Ashes, for it being for him having bought a reputation that preceded him, for him to land it so perfectly, for him to have the chutzpah to actually try and bowl his best ball first up, I think there's a good argument. I think there have certainly been better balls bowled, but perhaps no better ball at that particular moment with that set of preconditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
but it also said the whole argument about the ball of the century, right? I mean, we can be cynical about what has happened since. I mean, there was a Mitchell Starc ball in a World Cup which was nominated as the ball of the century. So many things. But all that comes from this premise. The premise was set by this ball. Nobody thought of this definition even before.
Yes. Yeah.
So this basically gave cricket a new lexicon, a new word in the lexicon, or a new term rather. And it's been abused since then. But we can't retrospectively sort of cut this down to size because it's been abused subsequently.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Mahesh. Couldn't agree more. And of course, by happening in the 90s, well, it did actually have the referent of the previous century, didn't it? There's no point talking about a ball of the century bowled in 2001. Yeah, got 99 years to go before we can evaluate whether it's a fair claim.
Talking about the ball of the century and Warne having this evidence of video as well. The line that he writes is, "You had to see Bradman to believe him. You had to see Warne again to believe him." So even with video, it was not enough. We needed the replays, we needed the pause, and to go back. We had to see him again to believe him.
Did I write that?
You did. And you also mentioned Jonathan Agnew's commentary for the ball of the century.
Yes.
And when he's in such utter disbelief, and he himself has to see the replay to figure out what happened.
Yeah. I think we all did. I think I was listening to the radio at the time, and I just went, "What? That can't be right. That can't be right. That's." But then, he made you believe the impossible. He made you believe that the unscripted must have been scripted.
That takes me on another question. I know as a journalist, you preferred not to watch the TV replays while you're at the press box, which means quite a lot of Warne's magic, you may not have got the full hang of it as you were watching it live, because all of us needed the replay to fully appreciate the magic of Warne.
Well, I mean, I watched a fair bit of him on TV because I watched his away tours as well. So you got the opportunity to see him bowl there by videogenic means. But yeah, I did I had an absurd Puritan objection to watching replays until about 2005, when I got one wrong. Actually, I twittered an umpire for having given a decision, and the replay proved that the player had actually nicked it. I thought, I'm going to have to get with the program now, I think.
But the thing about television, though, and again, another fascinating point that you make is how the first half of Warne's career, when he was so, when the spin was so exaggerated and when you saw the sideways movement, the two-dimensional vision on TV actually helped that. And how the second half of Warne's career, where he was more about control and varying his pace, and also the extent of spin that he imparted, how TV wasn't as friendly towards that. And that was fascinating. Do you think television, tends to be more partial to some spinners than others? Like I've always wondered why someone like Ashwin these days, is of course celebrated, but he's not glorified the way a Murali or a Warne used to be.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me about Warne was that he was not secretive at all about his methods. I mean, not only did he submit himself to the daily interrogation of TV, but he actually used to do exhibitions of his different deliveries. He'd show you how. They're often, there seemed to be Warne doing some masterclass every other day. And he thought, well, that's just the confidence of doing that. The fact that he absolutely showcased all his wiles, didn't care that you knew exactly what he was doing and you was prepared to go out and do it. That gave him an aura that preceded him. He so enlarged his own legend that it became impossible to play Warne simply as any other leg spinner. You were playing against the man as well against the ball.
Yeah, there was this recent series, India against Australia, where Cam Green was making his debut. And Ashwin was bowling and Shane Warne was on air, and he was constantly making the point about how Ashwin has to slow things down because he needs to make the debutant think a bit more in his head. Yeah. And each time Ashwin, quickly turned around and bowled, he said, no, slow down a bit more. He has to think. And that reveals so much, isn't it? And you mentioned that in the book as well. Yeah.
That was very much Warne's method, wasn't it? He had that little pause before he came into bowl. I think I said something like, only Harold Pinter has used the pause more effectively. But he drew the action towards himself. He just gave you that little bit longer in your stance to think about what was coming your way, what might be coming your way, even if Warne hadn't intended it. He was an absolute master of the dramaturgy of cricket.
And as you call it, he switched. He was not on. He switched the rest of it off and brought all the energies to himself. Yeah,
it was. I mean, it was amazing to be in the crowd or in the press box and watch the theatre of Warne being watched. I can remember at times. I remember a test match I watched I was downstairs in the MCG library during a test match in which Warne was bowling. And I can remember Warne coming on. And there'd been a conversation in the library beforehand about how various sort of old stages were complaining about Warne. Bloody Warne, he's done this, done that. He's a disgrace to cricket. He's a shame, brings shame on Australia. But then when Warne started bowling, that everyone gathered around the television and everyone was completely silent because Warne was coming on and you daren't be anywhere else. You absolutely had to watch every single delivery. And the great thing about Test cricket, we often say, is that your concentration in the course of a day can wax and wane. There are lulls and there are peaks and you don't actually have to pay attention to it all the time. But with Warne, you actually had to. You had to be there because every ball contained the possibility of some concealed event.
It's not just the ball, right? His walk back, his interactions with the fielders, as you mentioned. It was like being cornered in a dark alley by a neighborhood gang and having the only escape blocked by the biggest bruiser of all, looming out of darkness, green and gold knuckle dusters gleaming in a distant street light. It's an image that readily strikes a chord with everybody who's been in that situation. I mean, if this is what I feel, imagine a batsman who's been in that position. Like if Daniel Cullinan had to read it, he would readily sort of relate to
it. And it was great to be there. It was great to be watching that too, because you knew at least you weren't the target. So you were you were complicit in the intimidation of others because you stood aside and did nothing.
Yeah, and apart from the batsman, there was also the umpire there, right? And again, which you mentioned, how scannily he ended up using and interacting with the umpires. I recently, actually, last year, interviewed Steve Buckner, and I asked him about Shane Warne. And Steve Buckner said Shane Warne was very interesting because he would bowl a ball, he would appeal, and then, you'd say not out. Then he'd come back and say, yeah, actually, that was the right decision. It wasn't out. And it's almost like he's telling you, yeah, I know it's not out, but I had to appeal. And then he would say, and he would just mention that the next one's going to be a slider. And Steve Buckner said he wasn't telling me that, but he was saying it in my presence. And obviously, it comes through. So he said Shane Warne was exceptionally challenging to umpire against because of all these things that he used to bring in.
Oh, he used to play Rudy Kurtzen like a fruit machine, didn't he? I mean, he was just so good. You could see them laughing together. That's a funny one, Rudy. And, next ball, And Rudy loved doing the slow death. Rudy became part of the theatre as well.
Exactly. So, in fact, I don't know why. I was recently looking. Obviously, it wouldn't have even struck me before 2016. But I was recently looking at a video where Warne is talking to the umpires and there was some part of him that reminded me so much of Donald Trump. I don't know why. Like, this is the kind of thing Trump would do if he was a leg spinner.
Yeah, he's selling you some real estate. Yeah. But very charming if you're on the receiving end of it. You know, you want to be in the party. You don't want to be hanging around the fruit bowl waiting for someone to ask you to dance. Warne wraps his arm around you and says, "Come on in, join us. It's fun."
Absolutely. And as you said, I mean, it wasn't cheating per se. It was just part of the game.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I also think it's also his personality, right? It represents the fact that he was this global cricket citizen, and that represented in the way he sort of praised Lara or even Sachin, for instance, which he didn't have to do at all. Sachin was stonking him around the corner. It was a stake for his reputation at large, because this was billed as a contest of the century even by someone like Ian Chappell. It's very easy for him to have been withdrawing into his shell, but he rather embraced Sachin. He said, "This is the guy who took me on." So that spirit comes through even in the way he interacts with umpires. You know, he's never the one who's going to be sulking about a bad umpiring decision. He's not the one. Funnily, he does that as a commentator, which is very different from what he was as a player. But as a player, that kind of represented the spirit with which he played the game. I don't think it was particularly cunningly tactical.
No. I think the other thing is too that he was always up for the fight, even in adversity. John Buchanan, with whom he had a rather tense and tortuous relationship, once said to me that in 2001, Warne was the last Australian player to give up, even though he was under the cosh all the time and not bowling at his best and probably only partly fit. He was the one who rallied players at every break and kind of tried to convince them the series was still there for winning. You know, there's something indomitable about Warne's spirit that he could continue, that he didn't become so obsessively focused on his own performance that he didn't forget his obligations to the team.
That's another part that you cover, especially when you're talking about the bowling spells. You in fact rarely sort of zone in on the highlights in this book, and that goes well within the territory. But to the extent that you had to highlight, the two spells that you pick are the Hobart 99 and the Newlands 2002, about those sort of long, hard-working spells. It's one of those things that's always neglected about these great bowlers. Like someone like Dennis Lillee, for instance, you only remember the highlights package. But the real legend is actually in doing the hard yards, in bowling 70 overs when things were not working out well for you, in bowling 45 overs, I think 36 of them in succession when things are not going well for you. And these are grossly underappreciated about most of the great players, particularly someone like Warne, who appears magical.
I can remember a spell that he bowled at Perth in 2006 in the second innings. He seemed to bowl most of the day that day. It was incredibly hot and the pitch was incredibly flat. And Alistair Cook made 100, but Warne just whirled away gamely for over after over after over. I think he ended up with, 1 for 100 or something like that. And then McGrath came through with the second new ball and took 3 quick wickets. And I actually thought, people will not remember this spell at all. But I remember thinking at the time, I must watch this because I think that Warne's retirement is just around the corner. I must commit this to memory because I want to be able to tell future generations about it. Maybe that was the moment at which I thought that, or the germ of on Warne came together. I was conscious of watching something pass before me that was special that I'd like to be able to explain to others.
So Gideon, there is of course this art of Warne, which is like the extraordinary chapter in itself. But then there's also the next chapter which you have, which is the men of Warne, and where you pick out cricketers who you feel you can talk about in relation to Warne, whether it's Stuart McGill or Steve Waugh.
Yes.
Was there a temptation to pick cricketers outside Australia, say a Tendulkar or Murali? You do mention the Murali-Warne battle, but was there, or you didn't think about it?
No, Sid, I probably could have done. I could have done a lot of things. I think did I pick 5 cricketers? Maybe I was just thinking because there were going to be 5 chapters. I picked 5 cricketers.
Oh, yeah, 4, yeah.
Big 4. Yeah.
4, was it? Look, I can't even remember what was passing through my head at the moment. I've had a, 2-year-old child crawling around on the floor. I was my wife and I were living in a small flat as my house was being renovated. So I wrote the book on my lap. I didn't even have a desk. So, it was just a question of getting the thing done.
There's a very clear theme to that, right? He picked his bowling partner, McGrath, with whom he had to split the wickets. So
Yes.
when you compare it, in a way it was addressing the Murali comparison without directly taking to Murali.
Yeah, that's right.
He's essentially saying, Murali had all the 10 wickets for himself to pick. But,
Yes.
one had to split it with McGrath. The other one was with McGill, where there was always a constant comparison that when they played together, he had the better figures. And
That's
then
right.
he kind of contextualizes why that was the case. You only 2 spinners on a wicket where there's help for spinners.
Well, that's right. Yeah. I've always been kind of fascinated by the interpersonal dynamics of a cricket team, and somehow we imagine that statistics are a sort of an impartial witness, and we're kind of oblivious to the circumstances under which they're created. So it was an opportunity to explore general cricket themes through the medium of Warne.
Yeah, and that McGill comparison is amazing because you pick out so many strands in there. And you also mention how people, conveniently say when Warne and McGill played together, McGill had the better stats.
Yeah.
But, there's also the opposite of that, which is also important. When Warne played in unfriendly conditions where you could pick only one spinner, he had the better deal. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think the other thing about Warne was that he liked being the only spinner. He liked being one out against the opposition. He loved those odds. The idea of it wasn't a matter of him begrudging sharing the limelight, but he loved being the guy, the big dog. So it suited his personality to be the solitary spinner in a team.
Yeah, and it completely goes against the grain of spinners bowling in tandem, doesn't it? Because he liked bowling in tandem with the fast bowlers.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. I guess also because a fast bowler allowed him a little bit more time to recover after an over. The rhythm of cricket's always kind of fascinated me. The way in which fast bowlers and slow bowlers can operate in harmony, with the fast bowlers creating a rough for spinners to bowl into. Sometimes spinners can bowl their overs too quickly and not give fast bowlers an opportunity to recover. I know I've heard fast bowlers complain about spinners getting through their overs too quickly. There are all sorts of dimensions to the game that that can't be quantified by statistics, that are nonetheless kind of pretty significant.
Yeah, and especially, reading this book, it sort of almost makes a case for the fact of cricket being an individual game, which just happens to be played by a team, because there's so many instances where if you take Warne's relationship with Steve Waugh or his relationship with Buchanan, and it's almost like he is doing his thing while his team is also, there. But, that's a fascinating interpersonal relationship, especially that whole thing about the World Cup in '99 and the West Indies tour before that. It's so apparent that there was a clear schism there, and yet they won. They drew the series and they won the World Cup.
Well, they loved winning games. And ultimately, they were capable of sublimating all their differences because they all loved winning games.
So do you think that a bit too much is made about the fact of all for one and one for all, and cricket being a team game and things? You think there's a bit of it's overdone?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I play cricket every weekend, and I'm obsessed with my own performance. It's I'm disappointed if I fail, whether the team wins or not. I do like winning games too. But ultimately, I know that my day will be influenced very significantly by the instant feedback that I get about how well I've done. And any cricketer who says otherwise is kind of having you on a bit.
So yeah, I only ask that because we hear, or at least we used to hear before Sandpaper Gate, we used to hear a lot about the Australian way. We don't hear that often now, I guess. It's softened a bit, but maybe
that's the other thing about this book, right? It's constantly nagging away at this almost self-congratulatory image of Australia, not just in cricket. And he's constantly, I mean, he's not set out to break all those myths, but he's constantly questioning everything that Australia considers about itself. Like Australia always, likes winning. I'm like, who doesn't like winning? Anybody who plays the sport likes winning. Australia always looks at itself as a one who doesn't cheat, but there's no history to that, and there's no history to somebody else not being a cheat or whatever. So like this notion of Australia's almost insular belief of itself is being consistently pounded right through this book, including Steve Waugh's glorification of the baggy green and even the doping test, for instance, which Australia prides themselves on being ahead of the game, right? Basically, Matthew Hayden complains that Shoaib Akhtar and Mohammad Asif got away lightly, but because we had higher accountability for ourselves. Beyond that, I think he calls the bluff on almost all those pet peeves or the pet sort of theories of Australia of itself.
Yeah, and where the doping is concerned, where the diuretic is concerned, I think Warne was kind of self-deluding. I think that it's the one sort of crime or misdemeanor in his career that I can't really find any mitigating circumstances for, and his kind of bravado or his blaseness in handling that challenge was a bit of a function of where he was at that time. I'm pretty critical of Warne in those circumstances in a way that I think others were insufficiently critical. They kind of accepted him as at his word.
Actually, that's a point that I want to raise, particularly in the chapter on trials of Warne. Like there are sort of controversies in which you're basically saying this is the mainstream opinion, which is too extreme against Warne, and you're basically pulling that back, saying, consider the context, it was not so terrible. Like even the John affair, the sort of betting affair.
Yeah.
Affair. I think you try to be a little more sympathetic to him, considering the public opinion of it. At the same time, when it comes to the drug, you're basically saying the public opinion is a little too lenient. Let me push it this way. Yeah. So how much of this contextualizing Warne's so-called sins is your steady state opinion of this is what I as Gideon Haigh thinks, and also how much of it is saying this is the mainstream opinion, it's too much in the extreme, let me pull it back?
I'm always doing that. I'm always slightly at odds with mainstream opinion. Story of my life, really. I'm always inclined to question what I see as a consensus. I think that where the Salam Malik affair was concerned, I thought that sort of our subsequent discoveries about match fixing retrospectively coloured our opinion of what was taking place. It was quite you had to get back into the mindset of 1994. What exactly did we know about about corruption in cricket at that time? Players and nations and boards were incredibly naive and unprepared for it. And in some respects, Warne was incredibly naive, touring the subcontinent for the first time. These were guys who were completely unprepared and out of their depth, and young men who were put in the way of temptation. In some respects, he didn't do badly to stay out of more trouble. But where the doping was concerned, I thought the public relations campaign to play that down, the interview with the Current Affair and it's only a diuretic. It's not a performance-enhancing drug. My mum gave it to me. There was something really kind of corny about that, and a bit. I thought it showed Warne in his worst light, and amazingly, it seems to have been completely scrubbed from his reputation since, as we're inclined to do with athletes in Australia. There's always some reason why our athletes are defended under circumstances of doping allegations, because we'd never do that, would we? It's other countries who do.
And there's also the counterfactual that you mentioned with the Salim Malik affair, where had Australia actually taken a serious step to come down hard on the players, then who knows how things would have panned out in the 90s.
Yes, yeah. Well, we still make those kind of mistakes in Australia. We still flinch from taking really harsh action, and then that leads us to get to a point where we have to take extremely harsh action, as we did in 2018, because we'd let it play out, we'd let it go on for so long that an attitude of impunity had developed, and all of a sudden, it's panic stations, and only sort of year-long bans will satisfy us.
In fact, I was thinking about it. This is the third time I'm reading the book. I had never made the connect between the South Africa series of '94 and the fines imposed on Shane Warne and Merv Hughes for their behavior, for excessive appealing at that time.
Yeah.
And I mean, you contextualize it so beautifully. And in fact, I'm not sure if you realized it yourself, because it's almost a replication of the 2018. So, 2018 was a replication of this on a much grander scale. I mean, you've written a part of a book about it. Subsequently, you've written a book about the whole incident as well. And one of the things that Steve Warne makes, it's quite a statement to make, where he says they had been belittled, the players had been belittled for the sake of board wanting the public sympathy.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened in the case of Steve Smith. It's essentially, so there was an ICC penalty. There was a penalty imposed by the regulators of the game. But the cricket board, which had been complicit in the poor behavior all along, all of a sudden is reacting to public sentiment and going overboard on top of what's already been penalized. Of course, the scale with Stephen Smith was much more, but the episode is exactly the same. So it also tells us how much has not changed with Cricket Australia.
And somehow the administrators never take any responsibility at all. They're never held to account. Players always are.
Yeah, I highly recommend reading Gideon's book on that whole affair, the Sandpaper Gate and all and it's also tells you the bureaucratic sort of background that also leads to these kind of things happening. So, Gideon, talking about one thing I must mention though, and I don't think I've ever seen you as vehement about anything as much as Paul Barry's book about Shane Warne. That book really does things to you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was just pointless. It was a pointless exercise. If you're going to write about Warne, at least you have to make some token effort to understand what he does so well, and Barry doesn't. It's scraping the bottom of the barrel. The funny thing was that I sought permission to quote that book from Barry, and he wouldn't give it to me because I'd given it such a harsh review when it had come out.
Yeah, that is a review that I will link, and you should all read. That's a review that basically tells you exactly what a reviewer thought of the book, and there's no hiding in that one. It's just straight up reverse swinging Yorker. Go for it. But must have been a bit of a challenge. Again, you'll probably tell me you didn't think of it at all, but must have been a bit of a challenge of how much to include from Warne's sexcapades and how much to leave out, given that you were largely focusing on the cricketer. But you also do mention a lot of it in a nuanced perspective, saying people cared too much for something they actually shouldn't have.
Well, Warne said that all along, didn't he? Warne said, well, this is my business, not yours. Yeah, sure, I stuffed up, but, what's it got to do with you? And I think the strange thing is that he actually dragged the public around to his point of view. In the 1990s, we tended not to have very much else to worry about, I've always thought. We tended to get scandalised very, very easily. I think maybe after 9/11, that was a sort of a jolting reassertion of perspective and proportion. Maybe that had an effect on our news values, that we were actually capable of seeing that some things were tragic and some things were ghastly and some things were awful and some things were scary. And the escapades of a cricketer, by comparison, are relatively small beer. Now, periodically, the tabloids go back to Warne now and try to find some sort of misdemeanor or some sort of indiscretion. They last a mayfly's life, don't they, these stories? No one is surprised by anything Warne gets up to now, and frankly, nor should they be.
And the astonishing thing is that you mentioned this, and there are also other places that mention it, that irrespective of whatever he was up to, he was still performing on the field.
Yeah.
And, there was this incident where he was playing for Hampshire, he went to London, and then there was all these stuffed toys and all that scandal that broke out. But the fact is that the very next day he took 7 for 99 and won them a match.
It's actually the story that Warne tells in his own autobiography is brilliant. It's funny and sort of stupid and silly, but, he talks about driving back to the ground and, sort of putting the seat down and trying to get a couple of hours sleep before he goes out to play. He was always ready to play, no doubt about it. And who knows whether he played any better or any worse for a lack of sleep and a bit of an excess of testosterone.
Yeah, but that's the thing, Gideon. Is it also a cultural thing and got to do with the eras as well? Because when people talk about Gary Sobers or Viv Richards, it's almost as if they're hailed for their excesses. Like they drank till 5 a.m. in the morning, went out there, scored 100. Gary Sobers even writes about how he was inebriated in his final innings when he played. Yeah. And that seems to be like a bit of a glorification. But with Warne, it's almost like so much negative there, right?
Well, thing was that I think that the ground, as perhaps it is for these other players, was a refuge. It had complications, but ultimately he had the skill to get through them. In the end, the cricket ground is an area of great but finite possibilities, and Warne had the experience of having prevailed in similar circumstances and an expectation of ongoing success. So that was the one area, this boarded reality, where he was always in control. Whether other aspects of his life were often on the brink of chaos.
It's also a reflection of the society, right? Someone like Ian Botham or Gary Sobers, their excesses were celebrated because drinking escapades are fine, right? I mean, even Australia as a society prides itself on the drinking binge of its cricketers. But the moment it comes to sexcapades, extramarital affairs, anything to do with that, the society gets extremely moralistic. And in the case of Warne, even like the trials of Warne, he's basically taken 3 instances. One of them is the bookie match fixing thing, and the second one is the affair with the nurse, which got the tabloid on an overdrive in England. And the third one is the drug offense in the 2003 World Cup. And if you look at it, the easiest sort of controversy to defend here is the second one, which is about the sexcapades. We had no business in it. As he mentions, I only wished to watch him play cricket. I didn't want to marry him. So to the extent that anybody had a problem with it, it should have been his wife and family and nobody else. Yeah. But for the rest of the society to have so much emphasis on that to the exclusion of other more critical things about a sportsman itself is more a reflection of the society than the person. Yes. But what I found particularly interesting here is the distinction that he makes between the tabloid culture of London or England versus here, where they make all these things. They are more sort of keen on exposing these things, but they move on pretty quickly. It's a 2-day affair for them. Whereas it's a 2-year affair for Australia to process the implications of it, which I found surprising. I thought Australia as a society was a lot less prudish than England, but it seems to be the other way around when it comes to all these things.
Yeah, Warne, despite the fact that many of these tabloid scandals originated from England, always felt that he got a fairer deal from the media in England than he did in Australia. We were more inclined to posture and to bloviate here about what this might tell us about Warne, where in fact it actually told us very little about Warne, comparatively speaking. That was one of my arguments with the Barry book, was that he tried to have it both ways. He tried both to sort of deplore the tabloid culture, but he also kind of reveled in it, and he used it as his raw material. And I thought that was kind of disingenuous from Barry, who is actually otherwise quite a reputable journalist. But I thought at that point was kind of running out of figures in Australia that he could write scandalous biographies about. He'd previously written books about Alan Bond and Kerry Packer and James Packer, and he sort of thought he'd add Warne to the notches on his bedpost, and it didn't really work. The formula didn't work for Warne. There are different rules for a sportsman, and you actually, like I said before, you have to make some sort of effort at finding out why they are so good before you can tell us how bad they are.
And towards the end of this career, I mean, there's this part 4 that you mentioned, the Warne Mark IV, where he's basically pretty much going on to the IPL and winning Rajasthan Royals a championship, and also, moving on from Test cricket and one-day cricket, but still a kind of this presence that Australians are very, very still interested in. It's not like they've moved on from him. No. And there is that moment in the when he's mic'd up in that T20 game, Big Bash, and that becomes a big deal. It's almost like they wanted to hold on to him that much longer, right?
They did, and Warne wanted to hold on to them too, because once Warne stopped playing, he didn't have the opportunity to go out and prove that he was Shane Warne. There was a certain pathos about Warne once he finished. He'll always be Shane Warne, but he won't have the scope to go out and demonstrate it. So there's something a little bit melancholy about that. Warne still, in the commentary box, still talks as though he's still playing. He's one of those commentators who you almost feel could convince himself that he was up to going out there and doing the job himself. Other players detach much more easily. My friend Mike Atherton will say that the minute that he stopped playing, he stopped. He could understand the position of the players, but he wondered that he'd ever been a player at all. Warne still, if you listen to him, he still speaks about himself in the present tense. He belongs actually to that Jeff Boycott school that still thinks that he could go out and do it tomorrow.
Yeah, and during the Sydney Test, when India were chasing a really, really improbable total, he was still like, they're going to go for it. They're going for it. They should be going for it.
Yeah.
In fact, a part of that was explained away as sort of pressure from the producers to hype up a contest as a chase. I was very cynical of that because, even reading this book, for instance, the Adelaide 2006 Test, one had the same spirit. He thought this could be done. On the last day when everybody thought this was a draw, he thought this could be done. So that's a consistent theme with him as a player. So you could have that cynicism about some other commentator, but not one, because that's just the way he's always thought.
Yeah, that's what he does. And that's why they have him. And that's why he still has value as a commentator. I think that he does his best commentary when he's surrounded by foils to his native ebullience. I think when he's, sandwiched between Nasser Hussain and Mike Atherton, he's a fantastic commentator. There's a degree of sort of mutual respect and mutual affection, and he's quite incisive. He says the unexpected thing, the thing that kind of that cuts through, that connects. I think sometimes in Australia, he's sort of surrounded a bit by enablers and sycophants, which pander to his worst instincts.
Yeah, I was the other thing that I wanted to touch upon is that I actually happened to meet Warne a few years ago when he was in the US promoting that series with Sachin, that Stars or whatever series that was, All Stars. And I happened to ask him about the 2001 series. We're celebrating the 20-year anniversary of that. And he said an interesting thing. He said, a lot of people think, there's this impression that I bowled badly in that series. But he said, I actually bowled well. And and he said the Calcutta Test, when Lakshman and Dravid batted all day, he said through the day, I felt I bowled really well. Yeah. But their batting was so good that they were just getting me away. And so he said there was so many moments in his career like that when, his lack of success was equated to him not bowling well, when that was probably not true at all.
Yeah. I thought in that series, and I've watched quite a lot of that series subsequently. I mean, he's just short of fitness, I think. So he's capable of bowling 5 good balls in an over, but he's going to give you that release ball. I think he also, in the course of that series, became very obsessed with deviation and bowling into the rough from around the wicket. And, of course, Indian batsmen love that opportunity to free their arms and manoeuvre the ball around the field. So he probably wasn't bowling exactly the way that he should have against Laxman. I always thought that when he bowled in T20s in India for Rajasthan Royals, because of the inhibitions on the lines that he could bowl, he was actually forced to bowl with less spin and more wicket to wicket, and that perhaps was always the way that he should have bowled under those conditions.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Though, having said that, in 2004, when he came back, he bowled pretty well. And that first test in Bangalore, he got Lakshman LBW as well, and that was a good series for him.
He got a 6 wicket.
Funny, isn't it? We remember 2001, but we don't remember 2004.
Which is a series Australia won.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Cricket's always better when Australia lose, Sid. Let's face it.
That's what happens when you have a stand-in captain. The narratives go for a toss. You had to have Ricky Ponting. That would have been like, okay, this is a final frontier. What Steve Waugh couldn't achieve, Ricky Ponting came and achieved. But you have Gilchrist captaining. Nobody cares. Even Gilchrist didn't care to build up his legend.
It was marketing. It was ultimately marketing. Yeah.
Well, 2001 had that quality of being the first time. It had been really big, hadn't it? It was, in India won in 98. But we don't remember that series. But 2001, it just seemed like there was a concatenation of events and personalities, and the different trajectories of the different teams met at exactly the right moment. A little bit like 2005 in England.
Absolutely. And though one thing about 2004, though, had that last day in Chennai not been rained off,
yes,
and had India managed to win that test, then you were looking at a 2-2. So maybe that could have been a thing, but the last day was rained off, and then, maybe I'm just saying those little things could have added to the legend as well.
God, it was beautifully set up, wasn't it, that last day in Chennai? Oh. But perhaps we should do a series on the great days of Test cricket that didn't happen.
Yes, that would be brilliant. Yeah. What could have been?
Yeah. Like the 1942 Ashes.
Oh, yeah. Bradman could have got 3,000 runs. I
wonder whether Bradman would even have played. Maybe he would.
Really?
Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think in 1948 he felt as though he had to, because there'd been such a long hiatus between the last Test match. He felt an obligation to set cricket forth on its post-war path. If there'd been no war and there'd been a 1942 series, would Bradman necessarily have welcomed the chance to go to England again? All sorts of fascinating imponderables. I think he was really struggling in 1942 to go anywhere, or 1938 to go anywhere without his wife. I reckon there might have been an issue around the willingness of the board to accommodate Bradman's wife going to England in 1942. They did it very grudgingly in 1938, so maybe Bradman would not have toured. There you go. There's a counterfactual for you.
Wow.
Actually, there is a follow-up question on this. I've asked this before as well, given that you wrote on one, and that's not a topic that you would have readily chosen. Somebody gave you the idea.
Yeah.
But I'm reasonably sure one of your publishers would have given you an idea on writing a book on Bradman in your own sort of unique vantage position, where you're always taking a mainstream opinion and pulling it back from the extremes. Yeah. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but you're always conflicting. In some ways, you're also conflicting with your own self about Bradman, and that would have probably worked out quite well for a format like this. Have you considered that?
I have contemplated it, but I also, I look at my own shelf on Bradman, and there's just so damn much on it that the idea of adding to the stress on the bookshelves, I feel as though that's well-tilled ground, and I like to go places that haven't necessarily been thoroughly explored, and I might get around to it in due course, but I don't feel any particular hurry. I feel as though the Bradman legend is evolving even now. It's 20 years since he died. I don't think he looms anywhere near as large in Australian consciousness as he did in the later years of his life, when his reputation became kind of part of the recrudescence of Australian conservatism. I haven't seen where the legend's going to end up yet, so I might bide my time.
Which at least is not a outright rejection, so we keep our hopes high that it will eventually happen.
I have written quite a lot about Bradman in bits and pieces here and there, so I've had my say, but you're right, I haven't given up the on-worn treatment, if you like.
Yeah, I would love it. Right, there's a part of Bradman which is overemphasized at the cost of excluding a lot of other things. Like, for instance, I never appreciated his role as an administrator, his productivity as an administrator. Yeah. In fact, you did a piece on the number of meetings that he attended, the numbers. Like that kind of gives a perspective of Bradman that very few people know. I mean, we always remember his numbers from the cricket days, and the post-Packer revisionism of his time as an administrator, thanks to Ian Chappell and all the further generation of cricketers putting his role on administrators on the spot. But you're always constantly sort of moving the overhyped parts to the lesser hyped parts, and the lesser hyped parts to the to the center. So I would have loved to see that sort of balancing act exclusively on Bradman?
Well, I make up my own mind about things. I don't think it's as though I set out to challenge conventional wisdom. It's just that I've got no interest in conventional wisdom. I just, I want to work it out for myself.
But you're also talking with your own sort of images, right? Even with Kerry Packer, for instance, I'm sure your opinion on what you wrote about Packer and the influence on cricket in cricket war has changed quite dramatically. I mean, now everybody's quoting your book, and I know you've changed your own opinion on it. It's kind of funny. But you're also always sort of battling your own opinions over time.
Yeah, that's true, actually. In 1993, I mean, there hadn't really been any significant writing about World Series cricket since the time. And I think I detected an undercurrent of kind of disapproval, even retrospective disapproval of which had kind of embedded itself in conventional wisdom, that, the pajama game had ruined everything about cricket and nothing was sacred. And I thought, well, that actually doesn't tally with my own recollection or the part that Packer cricket played in my own upbringing. So maybe it's time for me to reacquaint myself with the subject and create a second draft of history. But I think since then, perhaps the general consensus has teetered over too far in the other direction, that events were now seen as a sort of an unmitigated good. In fact, they had all sorts of entailments that even now we're only coming to terms with.
So just going back to Bradman and bringing the discussion back to Warne, one of the reasons why I felt Bradman's legend endured for so long was also his reticence and his lack of being in the public space.
Yes.
And so there was the aura that could build. But someone like Warne and any cricketer these days, there's so much in the public sphere and so much in social media, and there's so much in there. Is it likely that their aura and their legend is going to endure as much, or will it just be going from one generation to the next?
Well, of course, one thing that we do have the advantage of with Warne is we have a lot of visual material to work with, and visual material has cut through that writing does not. I mean, it is very easy for a 10-year-old kid these days to go to YouTube and find an awful lot of Warne to watch, so you can see what the fuss was about. Much more difficult to do so where Bradman's concerned, and virtually impossible where Trump is concerned. So there is a degree of there's the possibility of a self-perpetuation of legend. What's probably the other possibility is that people get sick of it, that Warne kind of becomes too pervasive and spreads himself too thin, and becomes repetitive and a bit of a bore to listen to, and that potential is very real. So Warne has to be on guard against that. I'm not sure that he is on guard necessarily against that, but it is a possibility. People can easily get sick of you if you don't have some degree of kind of self-awareness.
Has he expressed any thoughts about the book?
No, not really. I very much doubt that he's read it. I know he's signed some copies, which is unusual for him. He certainly wouldn't sign the Paul Barry book. But I think enough people have told him that it's a sympathetic take on him, that he doesn't kind of resent it. I come across Warne from time to time, and he's always perfectly pleasant, as he's always been. He's actually a very easygoing, accessible, approachable bloke.
I was surprised when he agreed to talk to me, because I'd never met him before. Yeah.
He's always been very generous where the media is concerned. He's subtly contemptuous at the same time, but not begrudging. He recognises that they've played an important part in his fame, and that he has to continue feeding the beast, as it were. So, I mean, of course, social media has relieved him of the day-to-day chore of dealing with journalists. He can deal with the public more directly. We mustn't forget that that's also intensely mediated in an authorised way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last chapter, of course, rounds things off so well. And the thing with Gideon is that it's amazing how the number of political kind of analogies you're drawing through the book. And I had not heard of a few politicians who you're quoting there. So it was also a great learning for me to actually go and search out these guys and what they said and what they did. So thank you for educating me on Australian and other politics as well.
I can't even remember what you're talking about, Sid. Anyway, it's so long. It's all a bit of a blur. It's a month in 2012. Bloody hell. Still talking about it.
Did you read that book ever again after writing it?
No.
When was the last time you even browsed it?
I don't know. I never read my own books. It's too depressing. You only ever see the solecisms and the gaffes and no. I mean, I'm a classic journalist. Once it's written, there's nothing I can do about it. So I might as well just forget it and move on.
Yeah, I'm imagining you wouldn't have.
That's the thing about your journalism and writing, right? You always said your journalism subsidizes your book writing. And even in the piece that you wrote about writing a piece for Night Watchman, for instance, you talk about how journalism is in the moment, and a lot of pieces that you are always filled with regret after you send it out. But with books, you don't have that problem. You can afford to wait, but you don't choose to wait. You still choose to do it in 31 days.
Well, I mean, I also think that journalism is kind of inherently disposable, and everyone's got an opinion. And mine's no more valid than anybody else's. I'm just happen to have a way of getting it into a mainstream audience, but in the end, it's pretty perishable. And I'd hate for people to play back to me some of the opinions that I've held in the past. There's a lot to be thankful for about its disposability.
The internet never forgets, Gideon.
There's a lot to be thankful for where paywalls are concerned, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Paywalls. Yeah, which in fact, paywalls are also a negative in many ways because whenever I want to share a piece of yours, it's so difficult to share because unless people actually go and pay for the subscription. Yeah. Yeah, I think this covers quite a lot. Mahesh, do you have anything else to add?
No, just your final thoughts on your objective of this one. You say that you set out to basically reclaim him as a sportsman. Yeah. I know you haven't gone back, but were you happy with the effort? I know you never really sort of evaluate yourself, but were you happy with the objective of reclaiming him as a sportsman, which many books on Warne didn't tend to do?
Well, I think my main priority is always to enjoy myself in what I'm writing. And where Warne's concerned, you should always be enjoying yourself. He's a cricketer that's all about enjoyment. He's all chock full of fight and game for any challenge, and something for a cricketer. And I'm a cricketer who's still playing. Something you just go, wow, that's just amazing that he day in day out just threw himself into the ultimate challenge and came out on top more often than not. I'm sort of unstinting in my admiration for that. And if that sort of didn't get your juices going as a cricket writer, then you can find better ways to spend your time. So I enjoyed that month very much. But once it was done, and I moved on to other things. My next project's always the most interesting thing that I've ever done in my career.
And what is that?
Yeah, I mean, the book pretty much finishes with the line, and I think it captures so much about the book that, I essentially think, you quote, I think, William Hazlitt, basically, I think the book itself is about mastery rather than about Warne or about leg spin, or it's about the mastering of a craft, and it's so beautifully done. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I feel very fortunate to have lived through the Warne era. It was an important part of my upbringing, my education in the game. And like I said, I'm sort of roughly the same age as Warne, just a little bit older. So I can remember going through the 80s, being told about leg spin, being told that it was this amazing skill and that once you'd see it, you'd never forget it. But when you saw Australian leg spinners through that period, your Bob Hollands and your Peter Sleeps and your Jim Higgses, they were kind of eccentrics. They were outliers. The leg spin didn't look like the kind of thing that would ever win you a test match except on a hugely turning pitch. But then all of a sudden, when Warne appears, early 1990s, so almost 30 years ago, all of a sudden there was a leg spinner, and it was every bit as good as people had always told you. It was a myth made flesh, a prophecy fulfilled, and for the next 15 years, we had the opportunity to see that prophecy play out.
Yeah, that's probably also another reason why Indians of a much older generation still go slightly weak in the knees when you talk about Subhash Gupte.
Yeah.
Because Subhash Gupte was the classical leg spinner, and India hasn't had that classical leg spinner since. I mean, whether it's Chandra or Kumble, they've all been the unorthodox variety. So there is a charm to the classical leg spin.
Yes.
Category.
So can we offer our own spin on this? Shane Warne was the Indian classical leg spinner accidentally born as an Aussie.
Oh, going to Phil Ashisnandi there, Mahesh.
Yeah, talking about which, Gideon, we'd like to finish off by asking the writers who come on for a recommendation for one book. It could be any book across, a cricket, obviously, but it could be anything. So that doesn't mean it's the best book you've read. It's just a recommendation.
Okay, hang on, I'll have a look behind myself.
By the way, for those who can't see, there is the Gideon's magnificent bookshelf that we are looking at right now, and he's peering at it to see what he can pick out. Wisden almanacs are not allowed, Gideon. That's disqualified.
So the first time I read a piece on Gideon's favorite book was Derek Burley's Social History of English Cricket.
Earlier. What do you know? What have I picked out?
And he's picked it out.
Some cricket myths explored. I mean, this is a kind of an important book in my kind of upbringing in the game. It's published in 1979. This is the Sports Pages edition from 1989. It's a waspish take on cricket mythology, and the cricket's capacity for deluding itself about just how pure it is and how upstanding. It's a look at cricket's relationship to England and its various hypocrisies. And it's not the greatest book ever written, but it was a book that was formative in my attitudes to the game, my sort of desire to question orthodoxies, because Burley did it in such a refreshingly iconoclastic spirit that even if you didn't necessarily agree with him, you were kind of captivated by his nerve and independence. We started by saying that I call myself an independent cricket journalist. There's lots of different ways to define independence. Obviously, I'm not independent of Rupert Murdoch. I'm writing for him. But by the same token, no one has ever told me what to write at the Australian. And if they did, I wouldn't stick around to be told a second time, because I make up my own mind about things, and I plough my own furrow, right or wrong, never in doubt.
All right. Thank you, Gideon. Thank you for joining. And this was wonderful. And thank you for gracing our 100th episode.
Congratulations on 100 episodes. 100 in anything is worth celebrating. So it's been great to be part of it. Thanks.
That brings us to the end of another episode of the 81 All Out podcast. If you enjoy the work we do, please support us via ko-fi.com. That is ko-fi.com/81allout. You can find the link in the show notes. It will allow you to either set up a recurring monthly payment or to throw in a one-time contribution. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, all your contributions till the end of June will go towards COVID relief in India, and we will match your contributions up to $800. Stay safe and mask up. Goodbye.